The rain on the courtroom roof didn't sound like dramatic thunder. It sounded like gravel being kicked against a tin shed. It was flat, relentless, and gray. I sat at the wooden defense table, keeping my knees pressed together and my hands folded neatly over a plain brown manila folder. I wore a charcoal skirt suit that was 3 years old and a pair of dull leather flats. I had intentionally left my wedding ring at home, leaving a faint, pale groove around my ring finger. Across the aisle sat Julian, my husband, or, legally speaking, my petitioner for emergency guardianship and asset freeze. He had his arm lightly wrapped around the back of his stepmother's chair. Evelyn sat beside him like a crisp white napkin that had never touched food. She wore a ice blue silk blouse, her white gold hair pulled back into a coil so tight it smooth-talked her forehead into looking 20 years younger. She was dabbing the corners of her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, though there wasn't a single tear in sight. To the rest of the room, we were a tragic family vignette. The grieving, fragile young widow who had lost her mind after her father's death, being gently managed by her devoted husband and his selfless, dutiful stepmother. They thought I was empty. They thought when my father died 6 months ago, taking the last bit of my childhood with him, he took my spine, too. They thought the weeping girl who couldn't eat her soup for 2 weeks after the funeral was the only version of me that existed. Julian's lawyer, a man named Holloway whose breath smelled like peppermint and stale cigars, stood up first. He cleared his throat, adjusting a set of gold cuff links that Julian had stolen from my father's nightstand 3 weeks ago. "Your Honor," Holloway began, his voice dripping with practiced, greasy sympathy. "This is a painful day for the Vance family. We are not here out of malice, but out of desperate, loving necessity. Since the tragic passing of Mr. Arthur Vance, his daughter, Clara, has slipped into a profound, unmanageable state of cognitive decline and emotional distress." I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the scuff mark near the judge's podium. "Clara has been unable to handle the estate's day-to-day operations," Holloway continued, pacing smoothly along the wooden rail. "She has allowed major accounts to go unpaid. She has made wild, irrational cash withdrawals. Most tragically, she has developed an overwhelming paranoia toward her husband, Julian, who has done nothing but sacrifice his own career to manage her father's timber business in her stead." Evelyn let out a faint, shuddering sigh. Julian leaned over, whispering something soft in her ear, patting her shoulder with practiced tenderness. "We are asking the court," Holloway said, slamming his hand gently on his own desk for soft emphasis, "to grant emergency temporary conservatorship to Julian Vance and to place Arthur Vance's remaining accounts under the joint oversight of Julian and Evelyn Vance to protect Clara from her own tragic undoing." Judge Vance, no relation, thankfully, pushed her half-moon glasses up her nose. She looked tired. Judges in small county courts saw 100 family squabbles a month, most of them fueled by spite and cheap lawyers. "Mrs. Vance," the judge said, looking down at me over her glasses, "your attorney is not present." I stood up. I didn't rush. I pulled my shoulders back, letting the chair scrape softly against the floorboard. "I dismissed him this morning, Your Honor," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It was steady. It didn't have the tremble Julian had spent the last 6 months listening for over the breakfast table. Julian squinted at me slightly, his brow furrowing. Evelyn stopped dabbing her dry eyes. "You're representing yourself?" Judge Vance asked, a line deepening between her brows. "In a petition for full conservatorship." "I don't need a lawyer to read numbers, Your Honor," I replied. "And I don't need a proxy to tell you that I am entirely sane, though I admit I have been foolish." "Clara, sweetie, please," Evelyn murmured from across the aisle, reaching a manicured hand out toward me in fake pity. "Don't do this to yourself. Sit down. Let us help you." "Quiet in the gallery," the judge barked softly, tapping her pen. "Go on, Mrs. Vance." I reached down and picked up the manila folder. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. It held exactly 24 pages. "My father died 6 months ago," I said, walking slowly toward the center lectern. 18 days after his funeral, My husband presented me with what he claimed was my father's personal running ledger, a bound leather book tracking 40 years of private transactions, business loans, and cash reserves. I turned slightly to look at Julian. For a fraction of a second, his left eyelid twitched. Julian told me that my father had died nearly broke, I continued. He showed me entries detailing massive off-book debts to private lenders in Chicago. He told me that if we didn't quietly liquidate my father's remaining assets, the land, the equipment, the primary house, the creditors would come and take everything, leaving us with disgraced names and bankrupt records. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to her mental capacity, Holloway interrupted quickly, standing up. This is grief-induced fixation. Overruled, the judge said sharply. Let her speak. For 5 months, I said, keeping my gaze locked on the judge, I believed him. I was grieving. I was numb. I signed every paper Julian put in front of me. I signed over the signing authority for the timber yard. I signed over the house deed so it could be collateralized. I even signed a medical power of attorney last month when I was sick with a sudden, mysterious bout of stomach ulcers. Evelyn shifted in her chair, her ice blue blouse rustling. And then 3 weeks ago, I said, opening the manila folder, Julian brought me the physical ledger to sign off on a final batch of debt repayments to an entity called Vance and Associates LLC. He left the room to take a phone call. He thought I was upstairs crying, but I wasn't crying anymore. I was looking at the ink. I pulled out the first document, a high-resolution printout. My father was a creature of absolute habit, I said softly. He used a fountain pen with blue Parker ink for every legal document, check, and ledger entry he made from 1984 until the day he died. He bought it by the box from a shop in town. He kept the receipts. I held up the page. The ledger my husband presented to me, the one claiming my father owed $600,000 to private creditors, was written entirely in standard black ballpoint gel ink. Pilot G2, 0.7. A pen line that wasn't even manufactured until the late 90s, used in entries allegedly dated from 1988. A quiet stillness fell over the small courtroom. The gravelly rain outside seemed to get louder. Julian sat up straight, his face losing its soft, mournful color. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. It's an informal notebook. I didn't stop at the ink, I said, cutting him off cleanly. I took the ledger to an independent forensic document auditor in the city, and while he was examining the handwriting, I started digging into Vance and Associates LLC *, the company my husband and his stepmother said was holding my father's debt. I took out the second set of paper from my manila folder. Vance and Associates wasn't a Chicago creditor, I said, walking 2 steps closer to the judge's bench. It was incorporated 4 months ago in Delaware. The registered agent is a shell corporate provider, but the funding source used to pay the incorporation fees came directly from a personal Visa card ending in 4102. I looked directly at Evelyn. That's your card, Evelyn. The one my father bought you when you married him 5 years ago. The one he forgot to cancel before he passed. Evelyn's hand froze midair. Her porcelain mask didn't break, but the fake sadness vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp glare. They built a fake debt, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. They used my grief to trick me into signing over real assets to clear a lie. And when I stopped signing things 2 weeks ago because I started asking questions, they filed this emergency petition to lock me up in my own home and take the rest. Julian stood up from his chair, his face turning dark red. She's sick, Your Honor. She's pulling numbers out of thin air. She's been delusional for months. Sit down, Mr. Vance, Judge Vance snapped, her voice like a whip. Sit down right now, or I will have the bailiff place you in cuffs. Julian sank back into his chair, but his eyes were fixed on me, full of a venom I had never seen in the 6 years we had been married. Mrs. Vance, the judge said, leaning forward, do you have the auditor's sworn report in that file? I do, Your Honor, I said, handing the papers up to the bailiff. along with bank statements showing $200,000 transferred from my father's estate account directly into an offshore account owned by Evelyn Vance, dated 4 days after my father's memorial service. The courtroom fell into dead silence. Judge Vance took the papers, flipping through them slow, deliberate movements. Each turn of the page sounded like a dry clap. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at Evelyn. She looked down at the financial paper trail I had spent 3 weeks piecing together in the dead of night, while Julian thought I was asleep under the heavy blankets in the spare bedroom. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Vance said without looking up. Julian's lawyer cleared his throat again, but the suave demeanor was completely gone. "Yes, Your Honor." "I am denying your petition for emergency conservatorship," she said calmly. "Immediately." Evelyn let out a sharp intake of breath. "Furthermore," the judge continued, finally raising her eyes to lock onto Julian and Evelyn, "I am referring these documents to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into grand larceny, wire fraud, and forgery. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a heavy, final thud. Judge Vance stood up and walked off the bench into her chambers without another word. I stood there in my 3-year-old suit, my manila folder now empty in my hands. I didn't feel a rush of joy. I didn't feel like celebrating. I just felt clean. I turned around slow and faced my husband. Julian was staring at me as if a ghost had just walked out of my skin and replaced the wife he thought he owned. Evelyn was already pulling her phone out of her leather bag, her fingers tapping furiously against the glass, her face white as chalk. Julian took a step toward me, his voice low and dangerous as the bailiff moved closer to keep watch. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he hissed, his mouth twisted into something ugly. "You think a few bank pages mean you win? You don't know half of what your father owed, Clara. You have no idea what you just started." I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in 6 months. I didn't see the man who held my hand at the hospital. I didn't see the man who brought me tea when I couldn't get out of bed. I saw a thief who had gotten sloppy because he thought I was too weak to count. "I know exactly what I started, Julian," I said softly, slinging my bag over my shoulder. "And for the first time in 6 months, I know exactly how much I'm worth." I walked past them, out the double wooden doors of the courtroom, and into the cool, sharp air of the hallway. But as I reached the heavy glass doors leading out to the street, a young man in a dark gray coat stepped out from behind the marble pillars, blocking my path. He didn't look like a lawyer, and he certainly didn't look like a cop. He looked calm, sharp, and entirely out of place. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked, holding up a sleek black business card. "I'm done speaking for today," I said, trying to step around him. "I'm not with your husband, and I'm not with his stepmother," the man said softly, handing me the card anyway. "My name is Marcus. I worked for your father, not at the timber yard, at his other company." I froze, looking down at the card. It didn't have a company name, just a logo of a silver key and a single phone number. "What other company?" I asked. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice barely a whisper against the rain outside. "The ledger they forged was fake, Clara, but the debt wasn't." I stared at the black card in my hand. The silver key caught the pale overhead light of the courthouse lobby, sharp and gleaming. "My father ran a lumber yard," I said, my voice dropping an octave as a group of uniformed bailiffs walked past us toward the courtroom doors. "That was his entire life. He didn't have another company." "He had a lumber yard because trees hide things, Clara," Marcus said smoothly, keeping his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat. "And he didn't run it alone. Step outside with me. Your husband is about to come through those doors, and I don't think you want to give him the satisfaction of seeing you flustered." I glanced back over my shoulder. Through the frosted glass of the courtroom entrance, I could see the silhouette of Julian pacing furiously while Holloway waved his arms, trying to keep him quiet. Evelyn was standing near the bench, her phone pressed tight against her ear, her jaw locked into a hard, sharp line. Marcus was right. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the rainy afternoon. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing mist. We walked down the wide granite steps toward the curb, where a sleek black sedan was idling quietly. "I don't know you," I said, stopping at the bottom step. My father talked about everyone he worked with. He talked about the mill workers, the drivers, the accountants. He never mentioned a Marcus. Because if he mentioned me, he would have had to explain why he was paying me $200,000 a year out of a personal trust in Chicago, Marcus replied. He pulled a folded leather pocketbook from inside his coat and flipped it open, showing me a photograph. It was my father. He looked younger, maybe 10 years ago, standing on a muddy timber trail next to a tall, dark-haired man in a heavy work jacket. The tall man was Marcus, though his face looked harder than unpolished. "Arthur was a smart man, Clara," Marcus said, closing the pocketbook. "He built a massive fortune in land, but he also bought up commercial debt from dying industrial towns across the Midwest. He bought defaulted mortgages, equipment liens, private loans. He bought them for pennies on the dollar and held them. That's what I managed for him." My head was spinning. Why would he keep that a secret from me, from everyone? "Because of Evelyn," Marcus said simply. "Your father wasn't blind. He married Evelyn 6 years ago because he was lonely after your mother died, but it didn't take him long to figure out what she was. She was an absolute hawk for money. Within 18 months of the wedding, she was trying to get her name onto his primary accounts. Arthur knew if she found out about the secondary portfolio, she'd drain it or demand a divorce that would split it in half." I took a slow breath, the cold air burning my lungs. "So he hid it." "He hid it in plain sight," Marcus corrected. "Under a private trust named *AV, Holdings *. The portfolio earns roughly $3 million a year in passive interest and debt returns. But there's a problem." "What problem?" "Your father's sudden heart attack," Marcus said, looking at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. "It happened 3 days after he scheduled a private meeting with his lead estate attorney to officially transfer the entire trust directly into your name, bypassing his personal estate entirely. He never got to sign the final transfer paper." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying the timing was extremely convenient for Evelyn," Marcus said softly. "When Arthur died without that final document signed, the trust froze. Under state law, frozen trust assets without a designated beneficiary roll back into the primary estate after 6 months. And who stands to inherit half of the primary estate if you are declared unfit, or if the assets are liquidated?" "Julian and Evelyn," I whispered. "Precisely," Marcus said. "The fake ledger Julian brought you was a clumsy attempt to force you into panic selling the real estate before the trust unfroze. They knew if they could get you to sign over the land and the house to pay off fake debts, they could absorb the assets into their shell company before anyone realized what the primary estate was actually worth." I looked down at the manila folder tucked under my arm. The victory I had felt 10 minutes ago inside that courtroom suddenly felt small, almost childish. I hadn't stopped them. I had just caught them using the wrong pen. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, looking up at Marcus. "If the trust is frozen and rolls into the primary estate, wouldn't you lose your job?" "I don't care about the job, Clara," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a serious, grounded tone. "I cared about your father. He saved my family when I was drowning in debt 15 years ago. He was the most honest man I ever met, and he spent the last year of his life terrified that these 2 parasites were going to strip you clean the second he breathed his last. I promised him I'd look out for you." The heavy double doors at the top of the courtroom steps burst open. Julian came out first, his tie loosened, his jacket unbuttoned. Evelyn was a step behind him, her heels clicking loudly against the wet granite. Julian's eyes scanned the street until they landed directly on me and then on Marcus. Julian's face twisted in rage. He marched down the steps, ignoring the slick rain. "Clara," he roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the surrounding buildings. "What the hell is this? Who is this guy?" Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. He just stepped slightly in front of me, placing his shoulder between me and my husband. "Stay back, Mr. Vance," Marcus said calmly. "Get out of my way," Julian barked, reaching out to grab my arm. "Clara, get in the car right now. You think you played a clever little trick in there. You think the judge is just going to let you walk away from a 6-year marriage with everything. I made that lumber yard run for the last 3 years while your dad was sick." I stepped out from behind Marcus and looked Julian dead in the eye. "You didn't make anything run, Julian," I said, my voice ice cold. "You sat in my father's office, used his credit cards, and let his general manager do all the work while you and your stepmother figured out how to steal the land out from under me." "You little ungrateful bitch," Evelyn spat, coming up behind Julian. Her icy demeanor had completely cracked, revealing a raw, ugly desperation underneath. "We took care of you. When Arthur died, you were a complete mess. You couldn't even make your own coffee. Julian spent months keeping this family together while you sat in that house feeling sorry for yourself." "You didn't take care of me, Evelyn," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "You poisoned my mind. You fed me lies about my father's debts so I'd feel dependent on you. You wanted me small. You wanted me quiet." "You have no proof of anything," Julian yelled, pointing a finger at my face. "A fake ledger, so what? It was a mistake, a draft. We were trying to reorganize the estate's liabilities." "Save it for the district attorney, Julian," Marcus said smoothly. He opened the rear door of the black sedan behind us. "Mrs. Vance, we should go. We have a meeting in the city at 3. "She's not going anywhere with you." Julian lunged forward, grabbing the handle of my handbag. Before I could pull away, Marcus moved. It was fast, efficient, and completely silent. He grabbed Julian's wrist, twisted it back just enough to break his grip, and shoved him back 3 paces. Julian stumbled on the wet pavement, his leather shoes slipping, and fell hard onto his hands and knees in a puddle. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp. "Julian." Julian scrambled up, his hands covered in dirty water, his face dark with embarrassment and fury. "I'll ruin you, Clara. I swear to God, I'll take every square inch of that timber land. You won't have a dime left to pay your precious auditor." I looked at him sitting there on the wet asphalt. The man I had shared a bed with for 6 years. The man who had held my hand at my father's grave while secretly planning how to bankrupt me. "The land isn't yours, Julian," I said softly, stepping into the back seat of the sedan. "It never was." Marcus closed the door behind me, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled away from the curb before Julian could even reach the handle. Through the rear window, I watched Julian standing in the rain, his clothes soaked, screaming at the back of our car while Evelyn frantically pulled at his sleeve. I leaned back against the leather seat, my chest heaving as the adrenaline finally began to fade. My hands were shaking. "You okay?" Marcus asked, looking at me through the rearview mirror. "No," I said honestly. "I'm terrified." "Good," Marcus said with a slight nod. "Terrified means you're paying attention. Because what we're doing next is going to make Julian's little court petition look like a tea party." "Where are we going?" Marcus turned the car onto the main highway leading out of town, toward the skyline of the city 20 miles away. "We're going to see your father's primary executor," Marcus said. "The 6-month deadline on the trust expires at midnight tonight, Clara. If we don't open the real safe deposit box at the downtown bank before 4 o'clock today, the trust assets default automatically to Arthur's primary estate, where Evelyn's lawyers are already waiting to file an emergency freeze." I stared at the back of his head. A real safe deposit box. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, antique brass key. He held it up so I could see it in the mirror. "Your father didn't leave you a ledger, Clara," Marcus said. "He left you a key, but Evelyn knows about the box, and she has the second key." The rain slammed against the sedan's windshield as Marcus expertly maneuvered through the city traffic. My mind was racing, trying to put together 40 years of my father's life, a life I thought I knew inside out. "If Evelyn has the second key, why hasn't she opened the box already?" I asked, gripping the manila folder tighter against my lap. "Because it's a dual custody safety deposit box at First National Bank," Marcus explained, switching lanes as the city skyscrapers loomed ahead. It requires 2 keys turned simultaneously in 2 different locks, plus a biometric fingerprint match from either Arthur Vance or his primary blood heir. That's you, Clara. Evelyn had 1 key, but she was useless without your finger on that scanner. I looked down at my pale, bare hand. That's why she brought me to the bank 3 weeks ago under the pretense of updating estate documents. She tried to get me to scan my hand for a routine safe box access. And you refused. I hesitated, I whispered, remembering that cold Tuesday afternoon. Something in my gut told me not to touch that glass panel. I told her I felt faint and wanted to go home. That was the day Julian started talking about filing for my conservatorship. They realized you were losing your docility, Marcus said, stopping at a red light. Once they knew you wouldn't willingly open that box, they tried to legally declare you incompetent so Julian could act as your power of attorney and bypass the biometric scan entirely. The pieces fit together with a sickening, logical click. Every cup of tea Julian had brought me, every subtle suggestion that I was getting forgetful, every time Evelyn told me to just rest and let the men handle it, it was all an elaborate setup to steal the key right out of my hands. We have 35 minutes before the bank vaults close for the weekend, Marcus said, looking at the dashboard clock. It read 3:25 p.m. And once 4 o'clock hits, the 6-month probate window closes. The trust dissolves, and everything falls into the general estate where Evelyn's legal team can stall you in court for years until you're broke. We pulled up to the grand, granite facade of First National Bank in the heart of the financial district. The building looked like an impenetrable fortress of gray stone and brass. "Do you have your ID?" Marcus asked, cutting the engine. "In my bag," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. We stepped out of the car and hurried up the wide stone steps, pushing through the heavy brass revolving doors into the quiet, marble-lined lobby. The air inside was cool, smelling of old paper, polished bronze, and money. Marcus led me straight toward the back corner, where a heavy iron gate guarded the entrance to the vault basement. A gray-haired clerk in a sharp uniform sat behind a high desk. "Vault access for box 408, Marcus said smoothly, leaning over the counter. The clerk looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Names." "Clara Vance," I said, stepping forward, "and Arthur Vance's designated estate representative." The clerk typed something into his terminal, his eyes darting across the screen. He paused, frowning slightly. "Mrs. Vance, there appears to be a flag on this account. A secondary keyholder requested immediate access 15 minutes ago." My blood ran ice cold. "Who?" Before the clerk could answer, the heavy metallic click of the vault door echoed from the hallway behind the gate. Out walked Evelyn. She wasn't wearing her crisp ice-blue blouse anymore. She had thrown on a tailored black coat, her hair slightly disheveled, but her posture was rigid with triumphant malice. Beside her was a senior bank manager holding a velvet-lined silver tray. And right behind her stood Julian, wiping rain off his forehead with a handkerchief. They had driven straight from the court, while Marcus and I were talking outside. Evelyn stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing at the gate. A sinister, triumphant smile stretched across her face. "You're too late, Clara," Evelyn said, her voice echoing softly off the marble walls. "We presented the court filing for temporary asset preservation. The bank manager cleared access under emergency financial protocols." "The judge denied your petition, Evelyn," I said, stepping right up to the iron bars. "You don't have legal standing." "The judge denied the conservatorship, dear," Evelyn purred, stepping closer to the gate, holding up a small, dark velvet pouch. "But Holloway filed a notice of appeal 5 minutes after you walked out of that courtroom. Under bank policy, an active estate appeal combined with a primary keyholder allows temporary emergency access to secure disputed property." Julian stepped up beside his stepmother, looking at me with cold, bitter revenge. "You thought you played us, Clara. You thought a few ink receipts made you a mastermind. But my father and Evelyn knew how to handle bankers before you were even out of pigtails. Did you open box 408? Marcus asked sharply, his voice dropping into that dangerous, steady low tone. The bank manager looked uncomfortable, shifting his feet. The box has been retrieved from the deep vault, sir. We were just about to enter the dual-key chamber for final inventory. Then it hasn't been unlocked, Marcus said cleanly. He looked directly at the manager. My name is Marcus Reed. I am the chief trustee of AV Holdings. I am serving you with an immediate cease and desist under Administrative Code 409. B. This woman is attempting to access a trust asset using a fraudulent representation of a state authority. The bank manager's face went white. AV Holdings, the private ledger trust. Precisely, Marcus said, pulling a laminated gold-sealed document from his inner coat pocket and slamming it onto the clerk's counter. Arthur Vance established a priority access mandate. If Clara Vance is physically present in this building before 4:00 p.m. on the 6-month anniversary of his death, all court-ordered temporary stays are automatically overridden by her biometric print. Julian's eyes went wide. That's bullshit. She doesn't have executive power over the trust. She is the sole beneficiary, Mr. Vance, Marcus snapped, glaring at Julian. And you are currently trespassing on private trust proceedings. Manager, Evelyn said, her voice suddenly sharp and panicked, dropping the sweet facade entirely. Open that chamber right now. I hold the primary key. I hold the second key, I said, stepping past Marcus and pulling the brass key from my coat pocket. And I have the hand that matches my father's signature. The manager looked between the gold-sealed document, my brass key, and Evelyn's trembling hands. The corporate authority of AV Holdings clearly carried far more weight than Halloway's hasty court appeal. Clerk, the manager said nervously, pulling out his master keycard. Unlock the gate. Prepare the biometric scanner for Mrs. Vance. No, Julian lunged toward the gate, but 2 thick-necked bank security guards immediately stepped in, grabbing his arms and forcing him back against the marble pillar. Let go of me, Julian roared, thrashing against the guards. Clara, don't do this. You don't know what you're doing. That money belongs to the estate. It belongs to my father's memory, Julian, I said, stepping through the buzzing iron gate as it swung open. Evelyn tried to push past me into the vault room, but Marcus calmly stepped into her path, blocking the doorway with his frame. You stay outside, Mrs. Vance, Marcus said quietly to Evelyn. You've taken enough from this family. Evelyn stood trapped in the lobby, her face contorted in pure rage, her pristine blue and black outfit looking crumpled as she watched me walk down the narrow, reinforced hallway into the vault chamber. The room was silent, lined with thousands of gleaming steel boxes. In the center sat a heavy steel table, and on it rested a long, dark metal box bearing the gold numbers *408*. The manager placed the 2 keyholes in front of me. Insert your key on the right, Mrs. Vance, he said softly. I will insert the master key on the left, then place your right palm on the glass scanner. My hand was completely steady now. The trembling had stopped the moment I walked past Julian in the lobby. I inserted the brass key into the lock. The metal was cold. On 3, the manager said. 1, 2, 3. We turned the keys simultaneously. A deep, heavy mechanical clack echoed through the steel walls of the room. The manager stepped back. Place your palm on the scanner, please. I pressed my right hand against the glowing green glass screen. A soft hum vibrated through the table. A line of blue light swept up from my wrist to my fingertips. Beep. A digital voice spoke from a tiny speaker on the wall. Identity verified. Welcome, Clara Vance. The heavy lid of box 408 popped open an inch. The manager bowed his head slightly. I will give you privacy, Mrs. Vance. He turned and stepped out of the room, closing the heavy vault door behind him, leaving me in total, peaceful silence. I lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside lay no gold bars, no stacks of $100 bills. There was a thick, blue leather ledger, the *real* ledger, with every single entry written in dark blue Parker fountain pen ink, tracking millions of dollars in secured land deeds, commercial debts, and community investments my father had built over 40 years. And sitting right on top of the ledger was a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front in my father's familiar, thick cursive handwriting. I picked up the envelope, my thumb tracing the raised ink. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. My dearest Clara asterisk. If you are reading this inside the vault, it means you finally stopped letting Julian answer for you. It means you stood up, looked at the world with your own eyes, and realized how strong you truly are. I knew what Evelyn and Julian were trying to do. I saw the way they looked at my land, and I saw how they tried to make you feel small so you wouldn't fight back. I couldn't stop them while I was alive without putting you in danger of their desperation. So I set a trap. Everything in this box is yours. The land, the trust, the timber yard, and the future. Marcus will help you execute the transfer. Use it to build a life where no one ever makes you feel helpless again. I am so proud of you, my sweet girl. Love asterisk. Dad. A single tear slipped down my cheek, splashing onto the blue ink of my father's signature. But it wasn't a tear of grief. It was clean. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my inner pocket. I closed the heavy steel box, picked up the real ledger, and held it tightly against my chest. When the vault door clicked open and I walked back out into the main lobby, the scene was entirely different. 2 city police officers were standing near the entrance. Julian was in handcuffs, his head bowed, his face white as paper as an officer read him his rights for fraud and court perjury. Evelyn was sitting on a marble bench, her head buried in her hands, weeping genuine, bitter tears as a second officer stood over her with a notepad. As I walked past them toward the revolving doors, Julian looked up at me. His eyes were wide, desperate, and filled with a silent plea for mercy. I didn't stop. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the rain. The air didn't feel cold anymore. The gravelly rain didn't sound gray. It sounded like washing away dirt. Marcus was waiting by the sedan, holding the rear door open for me with a faint, respectful smile. "Where to now, Mrs. Vance?" he asked. I took a deep breath, looking out over the wide, open city skyline, feeling the weight of the real ledger in my arms and my father's key in my pocket. "To the timber yard, Marcus," I said, stepping into the car. "I have a company to run.